Hello, my name is Dr. Monika and welcome to part 3 of my lecture on the global extended family, the Melbourne fieldwork. My fieldwork in Melbourne is amongst 20 professional skilled Indonesian women who are working in the health and education sector in Melbourne, such as being nurses, doctors, dentists, or Indonesian language teachers in primary or secondary level. In other words, they are not maids. These women also have to negotiate a transnational and what I would call an intercultural form of mothering. The majority have mixed family. They may first come to Australia as a partner of an Anglo-Australian man and have Australian-Indonesian mixed heritage children. This type of mixed family and the form of mothering is intercultural because they feel they are transformed by the experience. And what they have to become is to be an independent mother and to bring up independent child or independent children because they have no maids here in Australia, unlike other mothers of middle class status in Indonesia who are able to have maids to take care of their housework. So these women that I did research with have to negotiate idealized form of transnational femininity being Indonesian mothers in Australia. What is really interesting from speaking with these women and socializing with them as an anthropologist is to understand their life as a professional woman and also to understand their family life. And this is a quote that comes from one of my research participants, where she described how here in Melbourne, Australia, there's no pembantu. Now, pembantu is an Indonesian word that means a helper, and it also means a maid and a nanny. So she has no pembantu here. She said, I have to do everything myself like a TKW. TKW is an Indonesian acronym for Tenaga Kerja Wanita, or Indonesian female domestic workers. And these are women who migrate overseas to work as maids and nannies. So the geographic proximity of Indonesia to Australia meant that there are a large number of Indonesians and Indonesian speakers in Australia. There are about 55,870 Indonesian speakers in Australia according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, where 0.3% or 0.3% of the entire population. In Melbourne itself, there is 1,321 speakers who live just in this part of Melbourne. Having this Indonesian Australian transnational life meant that they may be living in Melbourne amongst quite a sizable population of Indonesian speakers, yet they could also visit, and often do, visit on annual returns to see their extended family in Indonesia. As I said in my first lecture, it takes about 8 hours direct flight from Melbourne to Jakarta, Indonesia's capital city here in the island of Java. And they're able to see how back home or when they do travel, there is this perception of Indonesian migrant women and women workers as female domestic worker or those working as maids and nannies. Yet they are able to make fun of their own situation as mothers and housewife in Australia, where they describe themselves as being a maid and nanny to one's own nuclear family. However, they have the same type of middle class aspiration as their extended family members back in Indonesia where they would like their children to become doctors, teachers, nurses, and professionals like themselves. I will now describe some of the interviews that I did with these Indonesian women. One of them is Lian, an Indonesian language teacher in her 40s, who of Chinese-Indonesian background from Indonesia's capital city, Jakarta. She's of Christian faith, she's divorced now, and she has 2 teenage children living with her in Australia. She said, "It's not easy taking care of your own kids. Here you got no help, got no nanny, got no maid. Maybe I like children, whereas my mother doesn't really like children." So she compares herself to her own mother or the grandmother of her 2 teenage children. "My kid says, 'Mom, if only daddy is here,' or still married to her, 'I'm pretty sure you will have more than 2, because she likes children. But she replies, 'Oh, no. I said, 'Your brother is like a zombie. Make me like a zombie. I didn't sleep. The first 8 months, I didn't sleep.' So taking care of a newborn was very difficult for her second child. So for about 8 months since the birth of her second child, she felt she was like a zombie. She didn't sleep much, physically taking care of the second child." Here she described her relationship with her mother and the time when her mother visited her in Melbourne. "You ask her," so she asked her mother, "to mind the baby. She's like, 'How much does it cost you to hire a babysitter? I'd rather come up with the money and pay you.'" So that's what her mother said to Lian. That's her. "So my mother never came, She came when I was giving birth. And then she went home a week later. So she didn't even help mind the baby. She was only there for a week. And then she kept calling on the phone and asking, 'Are you okay?' So this really shows the differences in forms of mothering between her mother, who lived in Indonesia, and how she hired a babysitter to do the child minding, and how Lian had to be a hands-on mother in Australia. This is her aspiration for her kids. Lian said, "I want the kids to be healthy, and I want the kids to be able to be independent. Basically, in a good way. Independent and also knowing who they are, where they come from, and being able to help others, not being selfish." So I think that's all. So really, she's trying to teach her kids to also be able to be hands-on, helping others, help at home, help her as a mother, also help her to do the housework. This is an interview of another research participant, Cindy, and she's a nurse. She's separated from her Anglo-Australian husband, and she comes from Tanah Toraja, which is from the Sulawesi Island or Celebes, what is known as the Spice Island in Indonesia. She's also of Christian faith, 34 years old when I met her, and she has 2 girls aged 4 and 8. Cindy similarly said, "I'm everything. What can I say? I'm 24 hours." Means that she has to become a mother for 24 hours. "I'm quite labored," or she does a lot of labor-intensive housework and mothering. "The main thing is I would like to be the mother, the educator, the teacher, everything." So here she combines ideal forms of femininity, being a mother in the Indonesian way, which is being the educator, the teacher, but also the Australian way where she has to be quite hands-on. Here she explains what life is like in Indonesia compared to in Australia as a mother. "Back home in Indonesia, if you're working, you can get a maid or nanny to look after kids, and the amount of money that she pays in Australia, in Melbourne for childcare itself on a weekly basis, when she converts it, which is $450 a week, that's how much it costs for childcare here, it's about 4,450,000 a week in Indonesian wage, which is the amount you get for a monthly wage in Indonesia. It's very expensive, the childcare here in Australia. Back at home in Indonesia, you can get a maid for only 1.5 million a month, and they can do everything. So they can also take care of her children, and do the childminding, as well as doing the housework. In terms of the ideal of raising her children, she wanted them also to be independent. Again, the same word is repeated here in Cindy's interview as it was in Leanne's interview. She said she wants them to be independent from, not to become dependent on anyone, for example, on their husbands or boyfriends or anything, because that's how I was raised by my parents, to be independent. So here, interestingly, she used the word independent not as associated with an Australian ideal of raising your child, but also that was how she was raised in Indonesia. Not so much in a urban, cosmopolitan, middle-class capital city, but in a regional town, but still from a middle-class background. Whereas the father of her children, the Anglo-Australian man, for him, it is too early to teach him how to, cooking, how to clean the house, and how to, clean the room, and he sees primary age too young for that. But I'm the main carer, so I know what to do and what to decide. So she decided that her 4 and 8-year-old should learn to be independent, should help cook, clean the house and their own room. And here I have included a social media picture of Cindy and how she likes to project herself as an ideal mother for family and friends in Indonesia, and how she remains in contact with them and show that she physically mothers and take care of her daughter. She takes them on social outing for lunch, and also how her daughter at the age of 4 is able to write. So as an ideal Indonesian mother, being able to educate her child, but also being quite hands-on and physically mothering her child, which is an Australian value. Now, the last example from my research is on a research participant called Tina. She technically is not a mother. Biologically, she does not have a child. And what is interesting is that when I first met her, she said, "Don't call me Ibu." The second lecture, I describe how the Indonesian word for Ibu means both a mother and a wife and a missus. And because she's not a mother, nor is she married anymore, she said, "Don't call me Ibu, call me Mbak." So what is really interesting about the word Mbak is that it is a Javanese honorific for older female relatives. Now, Tina is Javanese. Javanese is the largest ethnic group in Indonesia. There are about 40% of Indonesians of Javanese ethnicity. And that's the main island where the capital city, Jakarta, is located. However, a lot of the maids of those who live in Jakarta, Tina grew up in Jakarta, even though she's of Javanese ethnicity, they come from the rural part of Java, poorer part. And these maids and nannies, the way they live in the homes of the middle-class family is that, yes, they are helpers, pembantu, maid and nanny, but because they live in the house, they are also regarded as a type of relative. So they are given an honorific, such as the title Mbak, which is an older female relative, and because they take care of the children, they do a lot of the housework, they have a similar role like an older female relative, as you would expect in a village, for example. However, it is also a form of exploitation whereby because these Mbak or these maids and nannies live with you, their working hours are often quite irregular, and they would ask them to work for you on Saturdays and Sundays, and some of them may not have a lot of time to themselves and they are working quite hard, being there for the children at odd hours of the day. And because they're treated like extended family, relatives, members, they're expected to be there continuously. However, for Tina, because her ex-Anglo-Australian husband has passed away and he was infertile, their planned children, who she planned to be bilingual, never eventuate. Being of a Javanese ethnicity, she was, however, able to adopt her nieces or her brother's daughters. This is a common form of cultural practice in Java, whereby if you are a woman who can biologically not become a mother, you can adopt your relatives' children. And for Tina, because she's an Indonesian language teacher, she was able to stay in Indonesia and return there during the school holidays on annual returns. And she was also in charge of her niece's education costs. She regularly has phone calls with them. She checks on their homeworks and their marks because she pays for their schooling. And what is really interesting is that she said she teaches them to be independent. But for Tina, unlike for Cindy, she talks about being independent as being able to eventually live in Australia and be an independent professional woman like her. So she teaches them to wash their own clothes, make their bed, cook and clean when she lives with them for 4 months of the year during the school holidays in Indonesia. So she wanted them to eventually come and live with her, join her in Australia, and she will sponsor their university, tuition fee, and eventually work in Australia as a young adult. So in effect, Tina, even though she biologically does not have a child, she is enacting a transnational form of mothering of her nieces in Indonesia. In conclusion, I have provided a comparative account of the project funded by Canada on Southeast Asian women, migration and family in the global era, and in the intersection of reproduction and migration, in terms of Indonesian women who work in the health and education sector, who migrate with the family, that they have or wish to have, and have their children residing with them in Melbourne, Australia. My research looked at beyond low-skill migration, gap in the literature, to look at the ambivalent role of having proximity with low-skilled domestic migrant women, yet being professional migrants themselves. They are not a maid, they don't have maids here in Australia, but they feel like a maid, having to do housework in their own nuclear family in Australia. The research project also unpacks static notion of a family of migrant women who are part of a mixed intercultural family, having children of both Indonesian and Australian heritage, as well as becoming a transnational mother. When you could not biologically have a child, you're able to adopt your nieces who live in Indonesia, such as Tina's story. And therefore, in terms of the transnational flow of people and ideas and the global discourse of the good parent, these Indonesian women are trying to negotiate both an Indonesian and Australian ideals of femininity, but intercultural forms of mothering and being independent, as well as having independent children. You can read more about my research in the article with this link here. It's a short one-page PDF on beyond assumptions about the domestic worker and the family in crisis. Thank you very much.